Where do I draw the line? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Well, a group of vegans did recently, and they provided us with an advertising billboard for our consideration. Some of you may have seen this. There we are. Here it is. All animals want to live. Where do you draw the line? Well, where do you draw the line? Draw the line on what? Well, where do you start eating? See, from the cat on the far left all the way through those creatures until the duck on the right-hand side, where do you start eating? Or to put it another way, where do pets end? And where does food begin? Well, for those of us who are vegans or vegetarians, and that would be quite a few of us here today, the answer to that question is quite simple. We wouldn't eat any of them. At least, not today, we wouldn't. But what if your life depended on it? What if your life or the life of one of your loved ones depended on eating one of those creatures? Would you rather die than start eating? Take that adorable Labrador in the middle of the screen there. Would you be willing to have that served up to you on a plate as the ultimate hot dog? Would you be willing to do that if it were a matter of life and death? What then? Where would you draw the line? What kind of moral choices would you make? And why would you make them? Well, those sorts of questions are asked at the beginning of the book of Daniel, in the story of Daniel and his friends. And it's set out in rather a stark way. Where do we make compromises and where do we not make compromises? Where do we draw the line between Christian or Adventist absolutes and matters of relative or only secondary importance? Let's see how the story begins. It's in the first chapter of Daniel. In the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The insignificant little state of Judah found itself squeezed by two superpowers of the time. To the south, Egypt. To the north, Babylon. They were the superpowers vying for world supremacy. And so it is that King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon annexed Judah, almost in sight of the pyramids, and put down his marker to the pharaohs. And that's the reason why these Judean prisoners of war make their way north to the city of Babylon. And out of all the things that we could be told about these Judean prisoners of war, notice those details highlighted, that these are young men without physical defect and handsome. Now, why bother telling us that? I mean, who cares whether they're without physical defect and handsome, or they could have been as ugly as sin? What's the significance of taking the time to tell us that? Well, the significance, I think, is based on this, that, as you probably know, in the Old Testament, priests had to be without physical defect. That's why I would never have made it. Not with, the sight in my right eye and my flat feet, I would not have been a priest. But just as priests had to be without physical defect, there was also a tradition that the royal house of Israel, of Judah, had handsome kings and beautiful people. The very first king of Israel, King Saul, he was an imposingly handsome man, head and shoulders above everybody else. But it's in the royal house of David where this is really significant. King David himself was a really handsome fellow. His son Absalom, with his long flowing locks, we're told there wasn't another person in Israel as handsome as Absalom was. And then there was the ravishingly beautiful Bathsheba, who was invited into the royal house. David's daughter, Tamar, was an exceptionally beautiful woman. And so then, these young people are like priests without physical defect. They're like kings. They are handsome. And the significance of that, I believe, goes back to one of the most important verses in the Old Testament, which sets out what Israel should be in the world. And this is in Exodus 19 and verse 6. God speaking to Moses. This is what Israel is to be in the world. You shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. A priestly kingdom, or kings and priests, or a kingdom of priests. It's translated in different ways. This is what Israel is to be in the world, kings and priests. So these young prisoners of war, who are like priests and kings, are true representative Israel as they go off into exile. And where are they going to be true representative Israelites? In the court of King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. That's where. And they are going to be educated in the best university in the world, the University of Babylon. And they're on full scholarships. Some of you students will drool at this. They are on full scholarships. Their tuition, their accommodation, all of their living expenses, every last penny paid for by the Babylonian government, because they are to be educated in order to bring glory to the empire. So on registration day, they sail through the formalities, they score highly in their Babylonian language placement test. They're introduced to their Babylonian tutors who explain to them the curriculum that they will be following for their 3-year degree course. And the first semester looks interesting, very interesting, especially for true representative Israelites. And they enroll for those modules using their new Babylonian names of Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Babylonian names which contain the names of Babylonian gods. Their Hebrew names had contained the name of the God of Israel. And the purpose of their bachelor's degree course is to educate them, we're told, in the literature and language of Babylon. They are to be educated to be true Babylonians. So they sit down and start leafing through their module descriptors. And the first of them is Intermediate Akkadian, the language written and oral of the Babylonian Empire. And by the end of the semester, students should be able to speak with confidence in the official language of the empire, compose in classical Akkadian literate reflections on the Babylonian worldview, sight read moderately difficult diplomatic correspondence. The following example gives an indication of the level of difficulty. Well, they are first years after all, so as you see, it isn't exceptionally difficult Akkadian. And then the second module, Foundations of Babylonian Theology. an introduction to the Babylonian scriptures and their teachings regarding the creation of the world, the origins of the gods, and the meaning of life. By the end of the semester, students should be able to defend and expound orthodox Babylonian doctrine, critically interact with opponents of Babylonian theology, and demonstrate conclusively the superiority of the high god Marduk to all other gods. And then, last but not least, every first year's favorite module, elementary hepatoscopy. I know you were waiting for this. Elementary hepatoscopy, which, as you all know, is an introduction to the art of predicting the future through close inspection of the entrails of animals, especially the livers of bulls. By the end of the quarter, students should be able to disembowel their own bull, identify, investigate, and interpret in detail, with no reference to manuals, the station, path, strength, palace gait, and well-being lobes of the liver, and identify, investigate, and interpret in detail, with reference to manuals where appropriate, the gallbladder, path to the left of the gallbladder, finger, yolk, and increase lobes of the liver. And they will be instructed in this art of hepatoscopy with the aid of models such as this. This is a clay liver from Babylon. You might just be able to see it's divided into various sections, and you can possibly make out some markings on this clay liver, which explains to the student the significance of that section of the liver for telling the future. And they will need to master this kind of instruction on this clay liver in elementary hepatoscopy. So a challenging semester, you would think. Okay, I was trying to cancel that, but we can leave that there for our delectation for the rest of the sermon. So a challenging semester, especially for true representative Israelites, because, mark my words, none of this had been discussed in Sabbath school class back in Jerusalem. But they tell themselves, we'll make it. We'll hang in there. We definitely will. But then comes the supreme challenge, the cafeteria. That is the big challenge, because all first years at the University of Babylon must eat food from the king's table. His most honored and excellent majesty, King Nebuchadnezzar II, will provide his guests, his international students on full scholarships, with food from his table. They will eat food from the king's table. Now, the king will not be there in person, but they will eat food from the king's table. But, as we know, they refuse to do so, and instead ask that they may simply receive vegetables, some vegetables and water. Now, why did Daniel and his friends refuse to eat that food? Well, strangely enough, that's a very difficult question, really, in some ways, to answer. You look at any basic or major commentary on Daniel, and you'll find people discussing what the reason could be, because the text never actually tells us exactly why they refused to eat. One reason could be that the food from the king's table had been offered to idols, so they refuse on that basis. Ellen White suggests that that is part of the problem, but not the whole problem, because all food at court was offered to idols, including vegetables, so they wouldn't get around all of it that way. And then another possible reason is that, being true representative Israelites, they would not want to break the laws concerning clean and unclean foods that we read in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14. because they're true representative Israelites, good Israelite boys. And you can be sure that those Babylonian chefs are not going to prepare the food in a kosher manner. So maybe that is part of it as well. Maybe it is the laws in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, partly. But if it is simply the laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, if that's what worries them, then why did they enroll in the University of Babylon in the first place? Because we've just had a look at the curriculum, and just about everything in it is condemned in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and other parts of the Bible. Idolatry, wizardry, mythology, hepatoscopy. Why not refuse to be educated by these godless Babylonian scholars? Refuse to read the textbook. Refuse to disembowel that bull. Why not draw the line there? Why only draw the line here when it comes to eating food from the king's table? What principle is at stake? Well, probably, I think, this. We're told specifically that the food they receive is not ordinary food. It is food from the king's table. A technical term is used for that. And at this time and in this culture, eating food from a king's table was a way in which you acknowledged the overlordship of the king. It was a binding act of covenant, of allegiance to the king. So refusing to eat from the king's table could be a very dangerous act, as the servant in Daniel 1 tells them. For example, on one occasion, David refuses to eat food with Saul at his table. He doesn't turn up for a meal, and Saul is so angry, he pronounces the death penalty on David. Well, that's pretty drastic, isn't it? Death penalty for not turning up for a meal. You can imagine what would happen at the Newbold church if, one of us didn't turn up for a potluck and the church board decided to disfellowship us. That would be a bit drastic. Well, why such an extreme reaction from Saul? Because David doesn't eat at his table? Because Saul surmises that David no longer accepts him as being his Lord and Master. And even for us, we know that a meal is often more than simply consuming food. An intimate, romantic, candlelit meal for two in an exclusive restaurant, a business lunch, no expenses spared in order to clinch that deal, or a wedding reception. We all recognize those meals are different in status from that egg sandwich that we scoffed down over lunch yesterday, all right? And so here, with Daniel and his friends, food from the king's table is much more than just a free lunch. And so whatever Daniel's motive is, whatever his motive and the motive of his friends are, I think this is at the heart of it. They say, here is where we draw the line. You can give us Babylonian names. You can educate us in Babylonian ways. You can teach us Babylonian language and theology and mythology and hepatoscopy. We'll go that far. We'll read the textbooks. We'll do the assignments. We'll even hand them in on time. But we will not, we'll sit the examinations, but do not think for one moment that you have captured our minds and our loyalties. We will not give that ultimate allegiance to King Nebuchadnezzar, nor his high god Marduk. We will not eat from the king's table. Well, Daniel and his friends find themselves living in a Babylonian world, in a world that doesn't accept the God of Israel. And they very quickly learn that they cannot take a stand on absolutely everything. They need to make a decision. Where are they going to draw the line? And they draw the line when it comes to eating food from the king's table. Where do you draw the line? Where do I draw the line? Because draw it, surely we must, in all kinds of matters, great and small, day in, day out, week in, week out. Let me give you an example, a simple example. This is nothing profound, but it had an effect on me many years ago when it happened. I very well remember the first funeral I ever conducted as a young pastoral intern. Mrs. Brown died, leaving only one living relative, and that was her sister. Her sister was not a church member, but she attended her sister's funeral. There was hardly anybody there at the funeral, and then afterwards, her sister invited me back to her home for some refreshment. Now, it became clear that as I entered the home, that this woman was poor, as it transpired, very poor. But she had gone to the time and the expense of preparing a plate of sandwiches just for me. And as she sat there reminiscing about her sister, I could still see the tears brimming in her eyes. She offered me the plate of sandwiches. Ham sandwiches. Every last one of them. Now, I said, in my young pastoral internship inner voice, where should I draw the line here? Should I draw the line here? Uphold the word of God as found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Make a witness. Or should I draw the line here and graciously accept the well-meaning hospitality of this grieving woman? I can see that some of you are more than a little interested in what I did. Well, I'm not going to tell you. Well, if you're really interested, you can ask me later. Okay. This is not under the Official Secrets Act. You can ask me later. But I would rather ask a more important question, which is, what would you have done? And why would you have done it? Drawing the line here or here? And where do we do so? Day in, day out, week in, week out, in all kinds of areas. In our sexual relationships, the television programs we watch, the books we read, the websites we visit, the kind of comments we leave on social media. Where do we draw the line? We often think of people who compromise on everything, never take a stand. They compromise on everything as lacking moral backbone. Yeah, probably quite right. But there are also people who never draw the line because they compromise on nothing. Absolutely nothing. And ongoing disputes around the world, from Africa to the Middle East, to the House of Commons, and possibly to a church board or two you may have sat on, amply demonstrate my point. It's now more than 60 years ago that the American theologian Richard Newbold wrote a landmark study called Christ and Culture. And in this book, Newbold examines how we as Christians should relate to our increasingly non-Christian culture. Effectively, in parts of that book, he's asking the question, where should we draw the line? Well, one option is that we conform to our culture. Well, that solves the problem straight away. No issues there. We just conform to our culture and relieve the pressure. The rather large downside of that is that we entirely lose our Christian or our Adventist identity if we do that. That's what those other Judean prisoners did when they tucked into food from the king's table. The second option is not to conform to our culture, but to withdraw from our culture, where we can create our own Christian or Adventist ghetto. And life inside that kind of community is so satisfying, so wonderful and cozy, because everybody you meet thinks just like you do. The problem is, Daniel and his friends didn't have that option. And I would suggest, despite concerted efforts in parts of the Adventist world, that we don't do so either. Well, if we're not going to conform to our culture, and we're not going to withdraw from our culture, what do we do then? Well, Newbold says this, that we engage with our culture. And engaging with our culture means living in the culture where we are, not conforming to it in every way, sometimes being willing to make some principled compromises, but knowing where to draw the line. And it seems that it's here, in engaging with our culture, that Daniel and his friends, that's what they choose to do. At the end of that opening story we get a report of how these young people do during their first year at the University of Babylon. And we read this, among them all, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They do extremely well. But do you notice something? The names they are given at the end of the first year here in the story, they're called by their Hebrew names, not by their Babylonian names. That is, in choosing where to draw the line, they remain true representative Israelites, true people of God. Now, there's no denying it. As you might have noticed, life is complex. And getting it right isn't always easy. Knowing when to compromise and when to not compromise. It's a fact of our spiritual lives that we need to make decisions, some of them rather difficult. What is absolute? What is relative? Where should we draw the line? But one thing for sure, it's much easier to know where to draw the line if we know at whose table we are eating. Because there is Nebuchadnezzar's table, but there is another table. to which each of us is invited. Invited to the table to sit with the one who is at the head of that table, who invites us to eat and to drink with him. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Amen.